Good morning, everyone. We're just going to allow a couple of moments for attendees to join the Zoom. We'll get started in just a minute or two. All right. Well, it's possible that attendees will continue to pile in as we go, but I think that in the interest of time and the amount of ground we have to cover, we should get started. So good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Berger. I'm the Executive Director at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and I will be serving as the moderator and sort of MC for this morning's webinar on our now launched report, Transferred Emissions Are Still Emissions, Why Fossil Fuel Asset Sales Need Enhanced Transparency and Carbon Accounting. I'll start off with a few opening remarks and then we'll hear from some others. Why don't we just get started? So we are at a crucial moment in the global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit the harmful effects of anthropogenic climate change. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade requires CO2 emissions to reach net zero around 2050. And to achieve that goal, we need to reduce emissions by about 50% by 2030, a deadline which continues to draw ever closer. Many of the leading publicly traded fossil fuel companies, including BP, Chevron, Eni, Exxon, Shell, and Total, have adopted mid-century net zero commitments. Some have also adopted interim targets for 2030 or another date. And some of these pledges provide some reference to the downstream emissions associated with fossil fuel products, also referred to as Scope 3 emissions. At the same time, there has been an observable trend of late in the sales of fossil fuel assets by these same large companies, often to smaller privately held companies or to private equity funds. These sales allow fossil fuel companies to write those emissions off their ledgers, but they are unlikely to result in any actual emission reductions. In fact, it is possible that the opposite is true, that the sale of fossil fuel assets by large oil and gas companies or by coal companies will result in more emissions, less disclosure about those emissions, and less overall accountability. That certainly has been the storyline that has dominated most of the reporting on this trend. It seems possibly that there's some kind of shell game at play here. So for us at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and our colleagues at the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, though, the possibility of this kind of movement around of assets and of emissions raised a question demanding some independent inquiry. What is the actual scale and scope of these transactions? Is there a way to account for the impact on related emissions, meaning both direct and downstream, or scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions? If this is happening a lot, and it seems likely that there is some consequence for climate change, what possible regulatory responses might be appropriate? The result of this inquiry is this report on Transferred Emissions Are Still Emissions, which we are launching today. In today's webinar, we will hear from two of the principal authors, Jack Arnold of CCSI and Martin Lockman of the Sabin Center. But before we begin, we need to acknowledge that we are obviously not the only people who have thought of this problem or who have sought to articulate or engage in the development of potential solutions. So to advance the conversation at the outset, we've invited Andrew Howell to share some initial thoughts. Andrew is the Senior Director of Sustainable Finance at Environmental Defense Fund, where he is responsible for engaging with the investor community to help accelerate the energy transition. He works on a range of sectors, including oil and gas, petrochemicals, transportation, and natural climate solutions. Andrew helped author EDF's related research titled Transferred Emissions: How Risks in Oil and Gas M&A Could Hamper the Energy Transition. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mike, and hi, everybody. Andrew Howell from Environmental Defense Fund. Really pleased to speak about this new report from Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and the Sabin Center. Transferred emissions, it's a topic we've been interested in at EDF for a while. But what's just encouraging is to see such an impressive new piece of scholarship here. It can really help further the understanding of this issue and the urgency of addressing it. Mike, you already summarized this issue pretty well. There is good news, which is that more public oil and gas operators have been setting climate targets for their assets. And that includes, as you said, some cases scope 3, and some cases focus more on cleaning up the emissions, methane emissions associated with the production. But the rub is that one way that companies can achieve those targets could be to sell the assets to a third party. Mergers and acquisitions, it's a big part of oil and gas. It's essentially as old as the industry itself. And it's not only oil and gas industry, M&A is just a part of capitalism. But we can have these perverse consequences from a climate perspective. What if the buyer of an asset has worse disclosure than the seller? The asset can kind of fall out of the public view. And what if the buyer does not have the same environmental standards as the seller? Stewardship of that asset may actually get worse, and the emissions, both the operational emissions or maybe even eventually the scope 3 gets extended longer, and you have the opposite result from the climate than kind of you get the sense from if you just look at the seller's disclosures. So there was some research EDF published last summer that Mike mentioned. We found that, yeah, indeed, a large and a rising number of oil and gas assets are moving from public to private hands, from operators with higher environmental standards, such as membership in OGMP, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, or a target on zero routine flaring. Companies that had those standards were selling assets to operators that did not. They were non-OGMP members, they didn't have flaring targets, et cetera. We found evidence that in some cases, stewardship did in fact deteriorate over specific assets that we saw had been sold. We had in the report a few of these smoking gun cases. So the most clear example probably is a deal in Nigeria where flaring shot up almost on the day of the sale of this asset by 3 oil majors to a local private operator. And today's report we're talking about today paints a similarly concerning picture, but there's a lot more empirical data behind it and examples that I think make the case. So, the reality is this is a real-time living problem. We see examples happening there all the time. One big potential deal that's being talked about that maybe doesn't quite fit the classic case of transferred emissions, but invokes it a lot, is the potential acquisition of Pioneer Resources by ExxonMobil. Pioneer, signatory of OGMP, ExxonMobil is not. So what happens with methane measurement of Pioneer's assets if that deal actually happens and closes? It's, I think, very resonant for the types of issues being talked about today. So I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the CCSI's and Sabin's recommendations for how to address the problem. One thing to mention from our side is we have developed an approach called the Climate Principles for Oil and Gas Mergers and Acquisitions, together with Ceres. These were developed out of a year-long consultative process that included several stakeholder roundtables. So explore this issue with oil and gas operators, with private equity investors, with M&A bankers, all the different folks who are involved in these transactions. And each of these convenings brought in a lot of insights about, frankly, this is a very challenging problem to tackle. It's not easy. People don't want to, when they sell an asset, they don't want to continue to be responsible for those emissions downstream. And so there are some challenges which this report talks about. We do feel that a voluntary framework for ensuring responsible asset transfer is helpful. And these climate principles, which you can find on our ESG by EDF website, will inform the search for solutions. I think the solutions ultimately will also have to include policy as well, but important steps to ensure that perverse consequences of M&A can, in fact, be minimized. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks so much, and back to you, Mike.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. So we'll turn now to Martin Lockman and Jack Arnold to talk about the report itself. I should say at this point that there will be time for a Q&A after the presentation and some further remarks. So please, as the conversation goes on, if you do have any questions, and we hope that you do, or discussion points, file them into the Q&A icon, on the Zoom, and we'll have some time to talk about those in a little bit. Okay, so Martin will be starting things off. Martin Lockman joined the Sabin Center last year as the 2022 to 2024 Climate Law Fellow. Prior to joining us here, Martin specialized in renewable energy and infrastructure finance at Milbank, and clerked at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. I'll just introduce Jack as well now, who will take over for Martin, and there will be a little back and forth between the two of them. Jack is a program associate at CCSI, where he supports the center's research and programmatic work on topics related to the energy transition, circular economy, and corporate sustainability. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. As Andrew discussed and as Mike discussed, in response to the growing impact of climate change, oil and gas companies are facing increasing regulatory and market pressure to report and reduce their own and their products' greenhouse gas emissions. So in response, corporate net zero emissions pledges often incorporate plans to sell upstream fossil fuel assets worth billions of dollars. While these company-specific emissions reduction plans may seem like a step in the right direction, corporate-level asset sales may not actually reduce global net emissions. So Jack, could you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So in recent years, investigative journalists have uncovered a trend of transfers by the so-called oil supermajors, BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Eni, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Total Energies, through which these companies sell some of their most carbon-intensive assets to less scrutinized, generally private-owned companies. A recent study by EDF found that between 2017 and 2021, a large volume of oil and gas assets shifted from operators with net zero targets to companies without those targets. That brings us to this paper. In transferred emissions or still emissions, we assess the regulatory landscape governing the corporate disclosure of fossil fuel asset sales. We outline the scale of these fossil fuel asset sales by the supermajors, and we start to kind of quantify the impact of these sales on asset level emissions. And we end our paper with a proposal for regulatory reforms to increase transparency around these sales. I'm going to give a little bit of the background of the regulatory structure and what disclosure rules we have in place right now in the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This background is covered in much more depth in the paper. I'm going to go over it fairly quickly here, just to give you a kind of overview of the transparency structure that we have, that all of these studies, all of these disclosures, and all of these recommendations are fitting into. Jack, if you could move to the next slide, please. And the one after this, actually. So the European Union has a detailed and relatively uniform set of regulatory disclosure standards for corporations operating in the United Kingdom, or in the European Union. Currently, the linchpin of that is the 2014 Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which enshrines this kind of concept of double materiality. Companies report information with financial materiality to the company and to its shareholders, as well as information with environmental and social materiality that describes the external effects of the company. These are interlaced with some very specific accounting principles that require disclosure of disposal, discontinued operations, assets held for sale. So under the EU's current structure, you can trace fossil fuel asset sales through the accounting of companies. However, in practice, these disclosures can be quite perfunctory. Asset sales might be aggregated, and the disclosures don't offer a lot of windows into where those assets are going, or how those assets are going to be used in the future. Separately, with respect to the environmental disclosures, there is some level of requirement for disclosures that are engaged in specifically to kind of manage environmental risk for a company. So if these fossil fuel companies are saying, oh, this is a risky asset, let's get rid of it, let's get it off our books. That kind of decision-making process must be disclosed. However, in practice, these are enormous multi-billion-dollar assets, and these sales are very, very rarely attributable to a single reason. So while conceptually this might capture some of these kind of fossil fuel asset transfers that are happening, or that are being pushed by emissions reductions goals, it's not a reliable net. It's not something that produces really usable data there. The EU is in the process of adopting a new set of disclosures related to, well, ESG metrics broadly, called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. These disclosures include requiring Scope 1, Scope 2, and to an extent Scope 3 emissions. And they contain some mechanisms that try and deal with these fossil fuel asset transfers. In particular, drafts of the proposed reporting directive require firms to reset their base year, which is the year against which their own emissions are calculated every 5 years. The idea being that if a company, changes size rapidly between 2015 and 2020, it doesn't necessarily count against its 2015 baseline when it's reporting year-over-year emissions changes. We can move to the UK. Thank you. The United Kingdom, which, as we all know, was formerly part of the European Union, has a similar approach to corporate emissions. In the United Kingdom, the key rule in place is the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Regulations from 2018, which in 2022 were supplemented with the Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Regulations. Together, these require the direct reporting of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, as well as kind of creating a structure for voluntary and encouraged reporting of Scope 3 emissions. Again, these rules can reveal the sales of emitting assets, but the disclosures are often perfunctory or vague. Separately, there are listing rules that require the real-time reporting of some significant transactions like asset sales. In this case, there are a set of significance tests based on the gross value of the assets, the profits attributable to the transferred assets, the consideration paid for the transaction. And all of these are testing against the size of the company. So while they have a kind of asset sales disclosure regime, it's something that when you're dealing with large oil and gas companies like super majors, may result in kind of minimal disclosures for multi-billion-dollar sales that, objectively are very, very large assets, but in the context of these, companies with many hundreds of billions of dollars in equity value are relatively small. If you move to the United States. And the United States takes a little bit of a different approach than the EU and the UK to corporate disclosures, in that the disclosures are really very kind of laser focused on materiality to the shareholders. So while there are some metrics that are required to be disclosed, even if there might not be material to the overall financial condition of the company, unlike the EU's double materiality standard, the disclosures that exist and the kind of new enhanced disclosures that are being proposed center around kind of shareholder value and materiality from a financial perspective. I see an error in this slide. That is incorrect. The United States is similarly considering enhanced and standardized climate-related disclosures. Currently, a number of companies do disclose climate risk. They disclose their emissions on a voluntary basis or under a basis that under the current regulatory regime because they deem it material. The enhanced rules will require companies to, well, as proposed, require companies to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and in some cases, Scope 3 emissions. And will also require companies to explicitly consider and disclose their strategies to mitigate or adapt to any identified transition risks. So these disclosures may similarly capture some of these sales that are motivated by emissions reduction goals, but they're not designed to do that. Again, the focus is on understanding risk to the shareholders of that specific company, and through a very kind of market-focused materiality lens. So Jack, if you can move into the...
Thank you, Martin. And hello, everyone. My name is Jack Arnold. I'm a program associate at CCSI. And over the course of the last year, I've been researching the topic of transferred emissions alongside my colleagues. And I primarily worked on the data-driven aspects of this report. So the data-driven section of this paper was inspired by the many questions that we had about this topic based on others' research, on case studies that we read, and news reports. And in this presentation, I'll do my best to highlight some of the answers to the questions we searched for while trying to clearly outline the assumptions, complications, and limitations of this part of the paper that's connected to the various data sources that we had and the challenges we faced throughout. So please feel free to ask any questions during the Q&A if anything comes up, or put a question in the Q&A in the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer it. So to understand how we conducted our research, I'll briefly outline the scope of the report. So we were particularly curious to find data on upstream asset sales between 2017, which was the first full year after the Paris Agreement, and 2021. This led to over 400 results, which is represented here by the blue circle. So to narrow the scope of the study to asset sales that may have had climate motivations associated with them, among other motivations, we narrowed the scope of the study to the following criteria. First, the asset must operate in the upstream business, meaning it must be part of the extraction process. Second, the asset must produce oil primarily. And third, the supermajors must sell the asset completely. And we assumed that if a company is trying to decrease its footprint, it would be more likely to sell its whole stake in an asset rather than just part of a stake. We also explicitly excluded farm in and farm out agreements, as well as swap deals, because we thought that these would be less likely to be climate-driven decisions. We also attributed 100% of the production of each asset to the supermajors, as the equity share of ownership was often very difficult to consistently find. And then one other important detail is that most of the assets in our study were not sold on an individual basis, but rather they were often part of a package deal that included other assets. And that further complicated some of our data research efforts. And so for that reason, part of the data analysis focuses on transactions in which assets were featured rather than just the assets themselves. So once we kind of narrowed our scope and applied the methodology to the data, we ended up with 76 transactions, which you can see in the orange in the circle. But then to further complicate things, we struggled to find consistent financial, production, and emissions data related to the assets in the 76 transactions. So only 31 of the 76 transactions and their underlying assets had complete information on production, emissions, and valuation data. And in this section, we use data from S&P Global Commodity Insights, as well as what we could find in supermajors' annual and sustainability reports, as well as news reports. So let's dive in. So once we had our database ready to go with the many variables we were interested in, we began searching for answers to the many questions we had. And to start, we sought to have an understanding of where the assets were located that we were looking at. And as you can see here in this graph, asset sales by the supermajors were occurring all around the world between 2017 and 2021. And in our sample, there was a particular emphasis on transactions in Europe and North America. And what made the analysis particularly difficult was that roughly half of the transactions, regardless of where they were located, were missing some sort of data, whether that be production data or emissions data or even other data as well. So when we broke it down by supermajor, some supermajors had more transactions featuring completely sold assets than other supermajors did. Exxon, Total, and Shell, for example, were the most prominent sellers in this regard. And based on the color distribution, you can tell that transactions were actually relatively evenly distributed between 2017 and 2021. So in the subsequent slides, we'll examine some of the production and emissions data that we found, but these only take into account those assets that had production and emissions data available for us. So that further narrowed our sample. So to understand the significance of the carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases that were being emitted at the assets themselves, or through the combustion of fossil fuel products further down the line, we asked what the scale of these assets' emissions are. How much do these assets emit, both in terms of scopes 1 and 2, but also further down the line through scope 3. Through S&P Global Commodity Insights, we had access to scope 1 and 2 data for some of the assets in our study. And then to estimate scope 3 emissions connected to the fossil fuel extracted at the assets, we applied an industry-wide scope 3 multiplier to the scope 1 emissions attributable to each asset to roughly estimate scope 3 emissions. We then compared these estimates, which you can see in the first column in gray, on a company-by-company basis to the reported and estimated scope 3 emissions from the supermajors, which you can see in the second column in gray, which showed us just how much these assets emitted on a relative basis during the period of the study, which you can see in the third column in gray. So the answer to our question was, the emissions related to these assets are quite significant, meaning that tremendous amounts of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases have shifted away from the supermajors during the time of the study. So we then asked which companies are taking over the supermajor shares in these assets. The answer to that question is actually quite mixed and a little bit surprising. In our sample, publicly listed buyers were the most frequent buyers. Even here, however, it was difficult to consistently find data. Oftentimes, the buyers' names were not even disclosed, which made it difficult for us to find and evaluate later on whether the assets were moving to less scrupulous buyers as a whole. To understand how transparent the supermajors are in regard to their sold assets, we scour their annual reports to find mentions of the sold assets in the relevant annual reports. In 58 of the 78 transactions, we found the underlying assets mentioned in a report. However, oftentimes the assets themselves were not mentioned by name, but rather by geography. Rarely were there any details such as production, emissions, or financial valuation of the asset featured in the report. So while asset sales may have been explicitly or vaguely mentioned in their reports relatively frequently, the supermajors were rarely detailed in their description of the assets, nor the motivation behind the sale. The next question we asked was, how did the supermajors profiles of the assets, how did the emissions profiles, of the assets change once the supermajors sold them? For the most part, there was an increase in average emissions intensity in the post-sale period. Here we used underlying data from S&P Global Commodity Insights, where available from 2014 to 2021 to understand emissions trends before and after the assets were sold. And our sample emissions increased on average by 25%, with a median of 22%. So to further investigate what happens to the assets once they leave the supermajors, we use Good Jobs First violation tracker database to examine the supermajors and the buying companies to better understand their track records. Violation Tracker is a database on corporate misconduct that covers banking, consumer protection, environmental, safety, and other cases resolved by federal regulatory agencies. So here we see the number of environmental violations per billion barrels of oil equivalent produced globally. And we did this analysis on a per BBOE level so as to bring the companies on the level playing field, as some companies are significantly larger and produce much more fossil fuels than others. The result is a wide range, with some buyers performing better and some buyers performing worse than the supermajors. What complicated things was that some buyers had no data at all, which made it difficult to compare. The supermajors in orange were distributed throughout. So overall, the 7 supermajors had 280 violations, averaging 40 violations per billion barrels of oil equivalent produced, whereas the 27 non-supermajors had a combined 1,600 environmental violations on the records, averaging 78 violations per billion barrels of oil equivalent. We then conducted the same analysis for non-environmental violations, and again, some performed better and some performed worse. In this case, the supermajors averaged 16 non-environmental violations, while the 27 non-supermajors averaged 49. This doesn't necessarily mean that when an asset leaves the supermajors' hands that the buyers will always have a worse track record, nor does it mean that the supermajors are good stewards either. What is important, however, is that there is greater disclosure on who is taking over the asset and what ends up happening with that asset in the years after it leaves the supermajors' portfolio. Overall, it was an arduous yet really eye-opening and fun experience conducting this data-driven research. A main takeaway of mine is that it's difficult to find data on what assets are being sold, to which companies are being sold to, for how much they're being sold, why they're being sold, and how much they eventually contribute to climate change, particularly when only looking at publicly available sources. This goes to show that improved transparency is an important step to facilitate tracking and regulating asset sales, which is not only critical for our work as researchers, but also for the work of others, including regulators and activists. For this reason, it's important to focus on opportunities for regulatory reform to fundamentally change how transparency works in the industry, which my colleague Martin Lockman will now discuss further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So our paper kind of addresses and proposes regulatory reforms with the idea that transparency is our goal here. Transparency is obviously kind of an intermediary goal. Our actual goal as human beings, as climate researchers, is to reduce the overall emissions and to kind of reduce the impact of climate change. But as Jack discussed, the kind of opacity in the current market, the opacity in the current emission structure is a real barrier to kind of developing policies and developing an understanding of what's going on when assets are traded back and forth. And this research showed two kind of interrelated challenges to coordinated climate action, which are first that the fossil fuel asset sales obscure the emissions landscape, right? Things are moving from companies that disclose to companies that don't. Things are moving from companies that disclose in one methodology to companies that disclose in another. And it's kind of hard to track assets between them. And separately, our research reveals that these fossil fuel asset sales may result in higher global emissions because of the increased emissions intensity of the assets post-sale. So yeah, we basically identified clearer data as a very necessary first step to supporting more significant direct policy action here. If you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So our first approach was a kind of addressing greenhouse gas accounting within the existing and adopted structures in the EU, UK, and the United States. First, we turned to base year recalculation. The greenhouse gas protocol, which is a widely adopted carbon and greenhouse gas accounting mechanism, requires each reporting company to identify or define and quantify a set inventory of emissions resulting from the kind of company's reporting universe. So the company sets a boundary around the assets that it's reporting, around the operations that it's reporting, and uses that to kind of show year-over-year changes in emissions. So each company establishes a base year. This is the year for which the verifiable emissions data is available, and uses that base year as a reference point, whether its emissions increase or decrease with reference to that year. The greenhouse gas protocol also provides that companies are required to kind of retroactively recalculate their base year emissions when they undergo significant structural changes. It specifically highlights mergers, acquisitions, and divestments. So a company applying this recalculation standard would be unable conceptually to achieve real emissions reduction simply by offloading emissions from sold assets. This is an interesting fact because if you go into the public statements of the super majors, you'll see a lot of executives talking about how they are meeting their, they're reducing their scope 1 emissions by X% by selling assets. And you really have to dig into the ways that they're applying these carbon accounting metrics to see if that's even theoretically possible. And recent report by the EDF Fund and Series, EDF and Series noted that base year recalculation, if this was done transparently, would disclose a lot of divested and acquired emissions and allow stakeholders to really understand the emissions reduction efforts that companies are undergoing. However, there are some issues with the ways that this has been applied. First off, just in the text of the greenhouse gas protocol, it says that recalculation is only triggered by significant changes. There's no clear definition of significance. We've seen industry participants and public market participants push for more transparency on this. Shareholder resolutions by As You Sow, a shareholder advocacy nonprofit, have recently called for ExxonMobil and Chevron to disclose their recalculated emissions baseline. ExxonMobil and Chevron both set their baselines in 2016 and have not recalculated, even though, as Jack pointed out, there's been an enormous amount of asset sale, mergers and acquisitions in that time, and divestments. So if you can move to the next slide, I can show a little bit about how base year recalculation would work in practice. Here we imagine a kind of a fake company. It has two assets, asset A and asset B. This is what the base year looks like in scenario one. And we kind of go through this company's emissions reporting in three scenarios. Scenario one has no asset transfers. Scenario two, there's a transfer 2 years out. And in scenario three, there's a transfer 2 years out and the baseline is recalculated. So here you see so actually you see here that in this base year, in scenario three, the company is only reporting 4 megatons of emissions. And this is because the base year recalculation is retroactive. So looking back at that year, the asset sale means that its underlying the denominator of its emissions reduction efforts is lower to start with. So if you can move to the next slide. So here you see in year one. And what we modeled here is that this company has two assets. Asset A, it doesn't get any more efficient over time, but they sell it in year two. Asset B, the company actually can increase its emissions or reduce its emissions through efficiency improvements, through structural changes to the way it operates asset B. So here you see asset B has reduced from 4 megatons per year to 3 megatons per year. In scenario one and scenario two, that looks like a 12.5% reduction. In scenario three, again, scenario three is the scenario that only looks at the assets that are retained over a long time. This company's getting credit with a 25% reduction. So they're saying scenario three looks at this and says, okay, of the assets you're maintaining and operating, you've reduced 25% of their emissions. If you can move to year two. Year two, the year when the asset A is sold, really shows year really shows where asset sales without recalculation make a mess of the efficiency reporting. In scenario one, this is the baseline, no asset transfers. The company overall has reduced its emissions by 25%. And this reflects the real world. They started out at 8 megatons a year. They're now emitting 6 megatons a year from the same assets. They've reduced by 25%. In scenario three, which has the base year recalculation, the company is only counting asset B, which is the one it's going to continue operating. And they've reduced emissions from asset B by 50%. This is still, a fair way of describing the world. But scenario two, which is what we have in many cases with companies like ExxonMobil that are not recalculating their base year, is that they've sold asset A, they've made it asset B 50% more efficient, and that looks like a 75% emissions reduction for the company. But that doesn't reflect what's going on in the real world, because asset A is still somewhere out there, possibly operating, polluting. We do not know, and it's not reflected in the reporting. So this kind of outline shows what base year recalculation does, which in the scenario three, it brings it a little bit more in line with the way emissions look in the real world. Base year recalculation does not solve a problem that we don't know what's happening with asset A, though. And that moves us to our second regulatory recommendation. What we call Scope 3.1 reporting. So currently, Scope 3 refers to indirect greenhouse gas emissions that are a consequence of the activities of the company, but occur from sources not owned or controlled by the company. This means emissions coming from upstream, from extraction and production of purchased materials, and from the use of that company's sold products and services. However, the sale of assets of the company, lines of business, are not clearly included in Scope 3. So we propose a Scope 3.1. In each reporting period, the Scope 3 emissions has to include the reasonably anticipated lifetime emissions resulting from the operation of capital assets and lines of business that are sold during that reporting period. And lifetime emissions would be the aggregated Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So really, what the company thinks will be emitted from its sold assets. And this kind of adopts a couple of key principles that are applied throughout the greenhouse gas protocols overall. First, there's an anti-amortization principle. Essentially, the greenhouse gas protocols say you have to report emissions in the year when products are bought, when products are sold, even if these are emissions that will occur over a long time. So it doesn't let companies amortize their emissions over the anticipated life. Applying that to an asset transfer, that means, if you sell an upstream, oil field, you have to report all of the emissions from that oil field over its anticipated life. The other principle here is that this requires sellers to think about and care about and disclose post-sale governance. At a minimum, this would require the selling company to gather data about a buyer's proposed use and governance of its assets so that they can report their own Scope 3 emissions. This means that sellers are also not kind of neutral about who buys assets. There's some advantage to sellers selling to companies that have emissions reduction plans rather than selling to companies that are just going to continue business as normal. So if you go into the next couple of slides, we can see what this actually would look like in the same hypothetical company. So this is a scenario 1, no divestment. This is the baseline. And you can see here we've got asset A and asset B. Asset B improves in efficiency and asset A doesn't. Could you move to scenario 2, please, Jack? So in scenario 2, this company divests asset A without either base year recalculation or Scope 3 reporting, or Scope 3.1 reporting. This means that their total emissions, you can see them drop dramatically in year 2. And as I said before, only a kind of small percentage of these reductions are actually from efficiency improvements. Part of it is just taking asset A off the map entirely. For many companies, the way that they seem to be applying their kind of reporting principles, this is what their emissions look like as the result of a divestment. Can you move to slide 3 or scenario 3? So in scenario 3, this applies Scope 3.1 reporting. In this scenario, the company sells asset A at the beginning of year 2 to a company with no emissions reduction plan whatsoever that continues to operate asset A for the remainder of its lifetime. In this, that means years 3 and 4, just for simplicity. So you can see that under the Scope 3.1 framework, the company would report a big spike in Scope 3 emissions from that asset because it has sold that asset. It's kind of realizing all of the future emissions from that asset in the year that it's sold. As a result, they increase pretty significantly in year 2 and then drop off again in year 3 and 4. And now if you would move to the next slide. Now this is a divestment with Scope 3.1 reporting, but this is a divestment to a company that has an emissions reduction plan. So in this scenario, the company in year 2 sells to a company that plans to immediately reduce the emissions from asset A by 50%. This is also reflected in the reporting. So as you can see, there's still a little bit of a jump in year 2, but it's not nearly the same kind of effect that you saw when they sold to a company with no emissions reduction plan. And again, this is a scenario that scenarios 3 and 4 are scenarios that reflect the actual emissions consequences of the company's actions, the company's economic activity. And the differences between scenario 3 and scenario 4 are the differences between a company that is kind of doesn't care what happens to its end product and a company that is selling to a manager that can manage the asset more efficiently. Great. And if you can move to our next. So moving away from the kind of carbon accounting mechanics, which are, conceptually relatively simple, although, politically, of course, these might be quite thorny, but conceptually, they're relatively simple tweaks to existing and developing frameworks. We also looked at some possibilities to kind of break from the existing reporting structures entirely. First off, we proposed that regulators could require the direct disclosure of asset level fossil fuel emissions. This would kind of be a supplement to the general materiality requirements with asset-specific disaggregated emissions disclosures. And the EU's laws already have a good model for this in their sector-specific country-by-country disclosure rules. EU requires issuers that kind of engage in extractive or logging industries to annually disclose their payments to governments and countries in which they operate. And this disclosures are disaggregated for each jurisdiction and are often tied to specific assets in that jurisdiction. So disaggregating this would give us a lot more detail about what is happening on the ground with specific assets on a company-by-company basis. And finally, Jack, we also proposed that jurisdictions should consider incorporating these upstream fossil fuel assets in kind of point source greenhouse gas inventories, monitoring the assets directly, and kind of breaking away from this corporate governance, corporate disclosure framework that we've kind of found ourselves trapped in. This could be something that happens in parallel to corporate reporting. It doesn't replace corporate reporting. But the EU, UK, and US all already maintain centralized databases of certain significant greenhouse gas emission sources, along with data about the beneficial ownership of these sources. And there's a clear demand for this kind of tracking. In 2022, the Carbon Tracker Initiative launched a global registry of fossil fuels, a civil society effort to do this kind of same project. And this kind of embedding those disclosures in regulations and statutes would really support these civil society efforts to track and understand resources. Frankly, it's also a little bit harder for kind of clever lawyers to get around. Focusing on immobile physical assets rather than corporate ownership may make manipulation and legal arbitrage significantly harder. And integrating these reservoirs into national GHG inventories could make it much easier to set and monitor national carbon budgets. So these are the set of proposals that we developed, ranging from kind of very detailed tweaks to carbon accounting mechanics to a kind of broad restructuring of the way that we think about corporate disclosures and whether these disclosures should be happening at the corporate level at all. So our main takeaways of this report. First off, our report really reveals that existing disclosure standards in the EU, UK, and US are really insufficient to track fossil fuel asset sales. These sales are common, and they've led to the offloading of significant greenhouse gas emissions by the super majors. And these fossil fuel assets by the super majors don't just shift greenhouse gas emissions, they may increase them. Sales from super majors may move assets to companies with worse track records in environmental and other matters. And there are a number of regulatory reforms based on the existing greenhouse gas emissions accounting frameworks that can kind of substantially increase transparency around these sales. As a final takeaway, tracking asset and jurisdiction-specific emissions and kind of regulating at the asset level rather than the corporate level may be more effective reform alternatives than tweaking emissions accounting frameworks. And I'll hand it over to Mike to MC a Q&A, because I know that we've dropped a lot on you.
Great, thanks so much, Martin, and thanks so much, Jack. I'll put aside a couple minutes for Q&A. We're 9 minutes to the hour, so I want to be respectful of people's time. Clark has posted one question in the Q&A. Yes, I'm sorry. We'll get to Andrew in just 1 second. I wanted to remind people to load questions up in the Q&A. Clark Williams-Derry has one there. We'll start with that, but first, we're going to hear from Andrew Logan of Ceres. Andrew, sorry, let me just pull up my brief notes here for the intro. Great, sorry, Andrew. Andrew is Senior Director of Oil and Gas at Ceres, where he works with investors to engage the oil and gas sector on key sustainability issues, including climate change, carbon asset risk, biodiversity, and water. And as you heard earlier, Ceres has been active in this space as well. So Andrew, we're looking forward to your reflections.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to all of the folks from Columbia, both for inviting Ceres to this event, but also, probably more importantly, for putting together this really, I think, interesting and actionable paper. It really fills a gap in both data and analysis that will allow, I think, some real acceleration of investor action on this issue. And in a way, the fact that a paper like this is necessary, that Jack and Martin had to spend all of this time tracking down data, just shows how important this sort of work is, and how poor the current state of disclosure is. Series were a coalition of 200 or so investors, from some very large investors like BlackRock and Fidelity, down to some fairly small ones. But we have a long history of engaging with the oil and gas sector on climate risk, and the issue that we're all talking about today around asset transfer and emissions, has emerged as a real area of interest over the last probably 18 months or so. And our investors come at this issue from many possible angles. They are owners of public companies, the oil majors that tend to be sellers of assets, and that in some cases are claiming asset sales as emissions reductions. They are limited partners in private equity funds in many cases that are purchasers of assets. They're also owners of debt of both public and private companies. And they're also universal owners. They are diversified investors who own the whole market and have a strong financial interest in seeing the world address climate change. And so they have a lot at stake here. You've heard a lot already about sort of the case for action and what the solution set needs to look like. I would only make just a couple of quick points in the interest of getting us to the Q&A. First, I just would underscore that there's a real need for leadership among companies on this issue. Andrew Howell earlier mentioned an investor guide that Ceres and EDF put out earlier this spring that has recommendations on best practice for the industry around this issue. And while we were able to find companies taking each of the steps that we recommend, it was very much a composite best practice. We have one company doing this and one company doing that, but really no one is doing everything or even close to everything. And so there's a real gap in leadership within the sector, and even among companies that have a reputation for taking climate change quite seriously. And then the second and final point is just that there is going to be increasingly public pressure on industry to step up. For the first time, as Martin noted, or maybe it was Jack, we are seeing shareholder proposals going to a vote on this issue later this month. Both Chevron and Exxon will see shareholders vote on the need for improved disclosure and accounting around asset transfer. We have every reason to expect that there will be strong votes, which is both a signal to industry that this is an issue they can't avoid, but that also, to Martin's earlier point about materiality and disclosure, materiality is obviously it's a key threshold for determining what needs to be reported. But it's also a moving target, right? So it's, what is material to some degree is just a reflection of what the average investor thinks is material. And so, if we get strong votes on those proposals at Chevron and Exxon, it'll be hard for companies to argue that this is not an issue that is material and that they need to address. So, want to repeat my thanks. Really excited to carry this report forward with investors, and I will hand it back to Michael and Martin and Jack.
Andrew, thank you so much for those comments and reflections. Well, we are almost at the hour, and we do have one more speaker. So, Clark, the quick answer to your question is that we can talk more about it offline, but we don't have a good answer to that. We have some anecdotal evidence, but why don't you and us talk about that a little bit later? For right now, I'm going to turn things over to Tom Sanzillo to wrap things up. And one thing I'll also say for those participants and attendees who do have follow-up questions or would like to reach out and be in touch with Jack, Martin, or any of the other co-authors on the paper, please do feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to follow up and answer additional questions. But to close things out, I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Tom is the Director of Financial Analysis at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEFA. He has produced influential studies on the oil, gas, petrochemical, and coal sectors in the United States and internationally, including company and credit analyses, facility development, oil and gas reserves, stock and commodity market analysis, and public and private financial structures, and has been part and parcel of this project from the get-go. So Tom, why don't you wrap things up for us?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks all of you for being on the call. And on behalf of my organization, I want to thank the Sabin Center and the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment for taking this on. We participated with you for a reason here. This is a seminal piece of research. About a week before you released this, week and a half, maybe it's a month, I don't know. Anyway, Comptroller Lander in New York just recently updated climate policies there. And part of his presentation, which probably no one paid any attention to, was that he wants to take a look at the metrics that the companies are now involved in and how they're developing, particularly emissions metrics. Now, when he's interested in doing it, it means not only that we see that climate change is causing some, to think about, to rethink things in terms of science and technology and regulation and governance, and also how companies that are producing the emissions are accounting for them. When he sees it, it's more than just a public policy issue. It's an issue of how investors now want to see things being done going forward and how business needs to conduct itself. I'm a former fund manager, and I know that I always needed to know what the rules of the road were, and I particularly needed to know what the rules of the road were when they were changing. And this report, particularly for the oil and gas sector, which is not doing well financially and hasn't been for over a decade, on what they need to do to start thinking through how they can participate. Not an easy task, but it's one where this report is a roadmap for that. And as Andrew and others have mentioned, this is a tool for accountability. It's also a really important piece of literature in the context that everyone who has talked about it has sort of danced around the fact that the United States is failing in any attempt to deal with the emissions issues. The other countries that are involved with taxonomy discussions and the like are doing a far better job of it to restructure their economy around sustainability principles than we are in the US. And so I'll just end here. And the report opened up my eyes to a whole series of institutional questions. And these institutional questions are going to be, I think, how we will continue our collaboration with Michael and Martin and Andrew and Perrine and Jack and the rest of the team at Columbia. So again, I want to thank you all for showing an interest in this and coming. And this is going to be a report that, as we say in our organization, has legs, and we plan to move it along. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, and thanks for your partnership, your thought partnership, and your engagement in this project from the outset. It would have been impossible for us to complete this without your and IEFA's engagement in this work. So we will wrap there. We're at time. Thank you again for joining us this morning. The report is either up online now or will be, well, it is up online right now, and the link will be distributed shortly. And we look forward to speaking with you further about this work moving forward. Thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.